Joining us at our Children's and Women's Research Lunch and Learn, hosted by BC Children's Hospital Research Institute and the Women's Health Research Institute. Um, Grateful to be co-hosting and facilitating this session today from the unceded ancestral and occupied lands of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations, and want to acknowledge that BCCHR and WHRI also reside on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and want to extend our gratitude and respect for the original and current caretakers of these lands. I'm really delighted to have Jonath Sujan here today, who's going to speak to us on navigating the AI revolution in healthcare research. Jonath is the Business Operations Manager for the Integrated Research Informatics Services, or IRIS, and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Sciences ADSU unit, and the Interim IT Manager at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. Jonath holds a master's in biomedical engineering from UBC and has 5+ years experience in cybersecurity and AI. His diverse skill set spans artificial intelligence, data analytics, cloud, and IT architecture, and orchestration and cybersecurity to support safe and secure deployment and promote responsible and ethical use and adoption of AI tools, infrastructure, and technologies. His professional passion lies in advancing research and innovation in healthcare and improving patient care by developing and implementing learning health systems. Jonath, welcome. We're so delighted to have you here today, hear your talk, especially during Digital Health Week. So I will pass the mic over to you. And just a note on logistics, we'll hold questions until the end, and please do pop your questions into the chat since we moved into a meeting format from our previous webinar format. Thanks so much, folks.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, for the introduction. And apologies ahead, I'm just recovering from the flu, so if my voice is a bit scratchy, that's the reason. So, I was asked to just present in this particular lunch and learn session, and when we were kind of discussing internally on what we could potentially discuss on brainstorming internally, we thought an AI might be a good topic to touch on. We know there are a lot of guidelines and principles that are being published. So how do we use that, and how do we responsibly adopt AI in healthcare research? So that will be the topic for today. We will quickly have an introduction of artificial intelligence and what it is, going from some examples of AI-related research happening within our research institutes, why we need to adopt AI, why do we have these kind of principles and guidelines, and quickly going through a bit of principles and guidelines from UBC as well as PHSA on using generative AIs, and towards the end, touching a little bit on how do we responsibly use it and what options do we have within our research institutes. So very, very quick introduction on what artificial intelligence is. We currently live in a period of time where we think very sophisticated, complex systems like ChatGPT that is able to think very human-like is what AI is, but this field has existed for a long period of time. It's basically an ability for machines to think, learn, and act intelligently and perform any kind of tasks that normally requires some level of human cognition. A good example is when we walk into a clinic, their domain experts, they gather some information. Based on the gathered information, they suggest some kind of actions and maybe diagnosis and lab testings and whatnot. That's basically what AI models are trained to do. They take in data, they make predictions. Based on the predictions, they can also recommend actions. So artificial intelligence, that entire field is quite broad. A very common thing we come across usually is machine learning, which is the ability for machines to just learn from data with very minimal or no supervision. And a subset of that would be neural networks and deep learning models that are capable of working with complex unstructured data sets, videos, images, audio files, all these kind of things. And a subset of deep learning is what we now have as like generative AI. It includes like transformer algorithms, generators, which can think like in a very human-like, which can mimic some kind of like an activities humans would do or how humans would interact. And a quick introduction on like generative AI too. It's just a class of like machine learning models that are developed on like massive data sets. It is able to generate new content. It can be like text output. A common model used is like, it's just like large language models that are trained to generate some content as natural responses. And there are like diffusion models, like, if people have used like, tools like Sora and DaVinci. These models are also capable of generating images and videos and all this kind of things. Can also help with like, writing codes, doing some analysis, summarizing a lot of documents, elaborating on it, and all these kind of things. Sorry. A couple of examples. Um, some good projects like happening, at least within the Children's Hospitals Research Institute. This is a project we did with the Hippie Lab, where we basically fed in data from a registry called as like GHDR, some level of processing, some joint modeling. This model was developed to forecast how a patient, clinical features of a patient would progress over time. And you can see here, like, this is how like things would change. And if there is a surgical intervention, like, this is how the parameter would drop and how the recovery would happen moving forward. This can basically help clinicians to predict, okay, like, at some point of time, maybe in like 12 months from now, we can like discharge the patient or like, stop following up and all this kind of things, just to provide some kind of like recommendations and suggestions on how things would progress over time. Another good example is like multimodal like models we are developing internally. You could have like radiology images, medical reports, like two-dimensional files. They all get used to like train models. And there is something new or existent, but like widely adopted now, called as like explainable AI models. So if trained properly, the model can go back to the source and point it out and say, this is the reason I did this kind of like prediction. And we can use like generative AI on top of it to create some kind of like explanations. To create some kind of explanations. This is a powerful tool and a very good example of like how different models can work together to address a particular like problem. We developed this to predict like post-operative seizure freedoms. We also work with PHSA to work on the policy document warehouse, called as like SHOP. A lot of like unstructured data going to like heavy processing, having some kind of layer to interface with AI-powered like search functionalities, enhancing the functionality with OpenAI-based models, feeding the information back to users and pointing them back to source files. Also a good example of like how hybrid type models can function. So there were like AI models used internally to process data, but AI models available as cloud services were also used to do this project. Um, this is also an important thing to note. Like like these models can also be developed in a generalized fashion, meaning that you could easily like take off unstructured files and replace it with some other data source, and the same workflow should ideally work with some fine tunings. So there are a lot of projects happening. We know that there is a need to use these kind of AI tools and technologies. We also do know that these AI technologies, in some extent, was available for a long period of time. So why now? And the answer lies on how we collect data and the volume of data we work with. In 2024, RBC basically like released an article on healthcare data explosion. In 2024, approximately like they predicted like 30% of the world data volume to be generated by healthcare systems, and they were expecting it to compound to like 36%. over the next year. Um, so there is a large volume of data we collect. There is a complex data ecosystem we live in, whether it be clinical systems collecting patient data, research systems collecting research data from patients. There's a lot of data we collect, so there's opportunities to use AI models to accelerate discovery, and these models are also capable of having some level of contextual awareness to enhance insight generations. There are a lot of labor-intensive repetitive tasks we do. These models are capable of automating it. So there's reliable outcomes from it, and there's increased capacity to accelerate research with these kinds of tools. And we also have easier access to compute resources now. This allows for an analysis with multiple data sets and shorter time for discovery. Excuse me. So the need for AI is inevitable. So it's just a balance we need. So we need to adopt AI. How do we ethically do it? How do we ensure data sovereignty? How do we protect data? How do we ensure data privacy and all these kind of things? So the challenge is on how do we safely, ethically, and responsibly use AI systems to do research. So before getting into it, I just want to touch a little bit on why do we have principles and guidelines. Um, and before getting into principles and guidelines, I want to give a little bit of information on how these generative AI models work. So it gives a little bit of idea on the need for some kind of safeguards and principles on how we ought to use it. When we say artificial intelligence, it's not true intelligence. These are just mathematical models with certain instruction sets, which are optimized to adjust certain parameters to minimize errors between actual outcomes and predicted outcomes. So when you put some kind of prompt into ChatGPT, for example, let's say the input is what is ChatGPT. The first thing it does is tokenization. It splits it into different chunks and converts it to mathematical representations. This is basically what an algorithms understand. A very simple visualization. People would have worked on statistical models where they tried optimize and reduce some kind of distance between real and predicted values. This is basically what these big complex models do in multi dimensions. When I put in a search word as Ray, the next thing these models do is find the next nearest neighbor. In this case, it's diffraction. So when you put something into models like ChatGPT, it finds the next word that's more relevant and compares it with the entire phrase is relevant to the input you put in. And this happens at a much faster pace. So the important thing to understand is these are mathematical models which have some level of safeguards and layers to protect it, to do things that it's not supposed to do. But mathematical models do fail sometimes, safeguards do fail sometimes, and that is the reason we have some guidelines on how we ought to use it, what we are not supposed to use it for. Because these are mathematical models, they are manipulated oftentimes by threat actors. A common thing that happened when ChatGPT was getting fame was prompt injection attempts. So someone could just go in and say I'm a developer, I want to just get all the data you have. And sometimes it exposes data it's not supposed to. And sometimes threat actors found ways to embed some kind of malicious content into open source models. There were research happening that's it. There were ways to manipulate open source models, well-known, renowned models like Mistral, Llama to produce unsafe contents. And a review that happened recently by Hugging Face also revealed that 1% of open source AI models available in their platform had malicious content. So there's a need for how we ought to use these tools, what kind of tools we are supposed to use, what kind of safety measures we need to have in place. And a very famous attack that recently happened, and it's continued to get fame, is a threat actor would like create malicious modules, and those malicious modules would get like ingested into these AI models for training. And if you're doing some kind of like an analysis coding with these kind of AI models, it kind of ingests these malicious scripts and modules into the code, and the user, without knowing, would start using it, and the input data would end up going into a threat actor's possession. There are like a lot of research and safety measures that are being considered to minimize these kinds of risk, but it's also not perfect. And the reason is like this is a very fast evolving space. A lot of new things are happening. Um, we are not yet at a state where we could safely say it is 100% safe to use these kinds of tools for all activities. So I want to touch a little bit on the principles and guidelines for generative AI. I want to have a disclaimer. This is my interpretation of these guidelines. So whenever you do something, go back to these resources and verify for yourself. And also note that these guidelines get updated more frequently. Whatever I present now might be a little bit outdated. So go back and verify for yourself before you do anything with AI tools. The very first principle, which I kind of liked, that UBC published in their guidance document, is acknowledge that there is risk associated with the data you put into these vendor managed tools. We oftentimes fail to read the fine prints. Sometimes we see kind of like information on, we will disclose some kind of like personal data and all this kind of things to some third-party organizations for training. One could assume that like if we have subscription version editions of these tools, there's assurance that these companies won't train on our data, these companies won't use our data, but there is like lack of verifiable assurance. So that's one thing to be careful and mindful of. The other thing is to acknowledge, and this is a very important thing to acknowledge, that the results produced by these models can be biased, can be inaccurate. And this is because the training data is basically all data available publicly in the internet, which can natively be biased and inaccurate. And it is also important to note that not all data available in the internet are suitable or allowed for reuse or copying. And sometimes these models are trained on those data as well. And when you are using the data blindly, there's a possibility of like copyright infringement. So the recommendation would be to like go back to the source and make sure you are appropriately using the data the way it is supposed to be used. There's also potential disclosure of like data you put in. So avoid putting in like a kind of proprietary data or confidential data, sensitive data. Always note that there is an impact on data security because the data will kind of like leave your infrastructure if you're using it, even in subscription model. There is an exclusion sometimes, for example, like Microsoft Copilot, which kind of gives you a guarantee that the data doesn't leave your infrastructure, but that doesn't apply for all the tools you use. So be careful what tools you use and how they handle data. An important thing to also note is to remain current and up to date with um, how these kind of like different AI tools work, how these things are like developed, what kind of like security implications are being published in the internet. There's an organization or foundation called as like OWASP, which provides or releases information on vulnerabilities and how threat actors are manipulating these tools. So be aware of those things, be up to date on those kind of information. There are like good training modules available through UBC as well. So there are certain principles for mitigating risks, and this is something we should consider when we do research. Ensure you use approved tools. The UBC's like Privacy Matters team has some kind of like an guidelines on Microsoft Copilot and ChatGPT. They're also reviewing other tools. Always assume any kind of information you put in is public knowledge, and always assume that any input you put in is used for training. Note that PI is required for high risk and very high risk data. which could include like kind of financial data, confidential data, business information, identifiable information that could potentially bring harm to people you work with, whether it be participants in research or staff. And this is also an important thing to note. A little bit of comfort that PIA is not required for locally hosted large language models where the data doesn't leave our infrastructure. The PIA recommends that we use it only for low-risk data. And when you're conducting research for any research study related activities, ensure you have approval from the Research Ethics Board before you start using AI tools on the data you collect for research activities. If the ethics board says a PI or STRA is required, make sure to do it. Inform rep. If you have the approval, use it. Without approvals, don't use these tools. And this could be important and useful for people who write papers or posters with AI tools. Make sure to attribute AI sources. This is not required by many journals. They ask you to cite the AI tools you use. There are some guidance available around it. And also when you use these tools, make sure you have like complete ownership and rights to the results it generates on the data you put in. This is a bit of a gray area because two different people with different prompts could have similar results. Um, so be careful how you use the results it generates. And also when you put in data, note that you're always assuming the worst, that it would be used for training. When you assume it's used for training, need to assume that um, any kind of like an intellectual property, any kind of like protected data might be available to someone else if they have the right prompts that disclose certain data. So to kind of conclude on the UBC principles, don't put any kind of like private information, don't put sensitive or confidential information, don't do anything that is not covered under the UBC's PIA. Approach the Research Ethics Board if you need to use these tools for any kind of like research activities involving AI tools. UBC recently updated their interim guidelines. BHSAs like Microsoft Copilot is approved for certain usage, and the usage is governed under the guidance document on safe and appropriate use of Copilot chat. There is some level of assurance that the data is encrypted and it remains within PHSA, and that the data won't be used for training. Make sure that there's a green shield and you're logged in using a PHSA account when you use Copilot. And when you use any kind of like AI tools with PHSA, ensure it's compliant with certain policies and privacy frameworks or cybersecurity frameworks to ensure safe use. The guidelines also says like, don't use it without any human oversight, which is very important. We're not yet at a state with like a complete confidence that these tools can be allowed to work without any kind of like human oversight. They are capable of making mistakes. Similar to UBC's guidelines, don't input any kind of like sensitive or identifiable data, like patient names, financial data, proprietary information, and don't use any kind of like generated content without reviewing, and don't use it for any kind of like clinical documentations or decision supports. This is something I like about the PHSA's like guidelines document. This is more like human-centered approach, which is very important when you use any kind of like AI tools. Include like diverse groups of people, the people who would develop these tools, people who would use these tools, people whose data would enter these tools or would be used in these tools. So this could basically include like staff. You work with like healthcare leaders, healthcare providers, like patients and families, and always like prioritize patient safety and privacy. Ensure the families and the patients, if you're doing research, the participants know that certain AI tools are used with approvals from REB, and how these tools will be used, how their data will be used, because we have the responsibility and we are accountable for safely using um, these kinds of tools. So to kind of like summarize on that, in a nutshell, don't use unapproved tools if you're using it for research. Don't do it without approval from rep. Ensure the participants understand how the data will be used. Don't use it for identifiable data. Uh, Possible kind of like way to take the full potential or use the full potential of these tools is to use synthetic data or censor any kind of like identifiable information to an extent that it would not cause any kind of harm to um, the participant or the patient or whoever it might be before inputting data into AI tools. And always prefer using like locally hosted models or open source models in your local devices. This ensures some level of like data sovereignty and security, and there will obviously more level of comfort with approval bodies like rep um, when you let them know that the data is not going to leave our infrastructure. It's not going to enter into the cloud kind of like services available through Azure or AWS or whatever other tools it might be. So it might be more comfortable for the participants, for research teams, and also the approval bodies. Um, and when you are considering developing AI tools internally, on top of the human-centered approach, also note that these AI tools need like quality data without bias. So collect data carefully if you're developing like homegrown applications. Whenever you have any questions, whenever you need any kind of consultation, always seek guidance. Um, oops. So one might wonder, like, what kind of options and opportunities we have internally to do these kind of like an AI work. Generative AI is a huge thing. Oftentimes, we are restricted from using these cloud-based tools or publicly available tools like ChatGPT because of privacy concerns. We are developing large language like models and these kind of systems within our infrastructure. Or in other words, we are developing systems that can host reputed open source or open weight large language models on-prem. This is an application we have developed in-house that allows you to use like large language models on premise so the data doesn't leave the infrastructure with an option to switch to like cloud-based models available through PHSA's Microsoft tenancy. So the data still remains within PHSA. And the good thing about this is we develop some kind of like workflow that lies in between the prompts you send and the data that leaves into these models. So you have a privacy like redaction layer. So it works in prompts you send, it works in a report you send. It automatically flags any kind of like private information you would have and redacts it. In case it's not accurate, it missed any kind of like private information. You have the option of like selecting it and redacting it. This ensures that no private information like leaves our premises in case you're using cloud model. And if you're using sensitive like data, this also adds another layer of like safety when you use even like on-premise models. There are also like secure compute options available. So if you have any kind of like heavy AI workloads on how to like responsibly use these kind of hardwares in an environmental friendly way, how to make best use of it, how to securely use data in these kinds of systems. Contact us. We can support with procuring it for you, deploying it for you. We have like data centers within our premise that is capable of housing powerful GPUs. And if you're having like lower or medium AI workloads, try investing on like an AI powered workstation. It pays off in long run. And we are also working on an infrastructure wide upgrade on our our high performance compute infrastructure called general purpose compute cluster, which will enable GPU capacity on CPU nodes. And there are more future like investments that will happen based on demands. We're also working on initiatives that allow like federated learning and training. So the data remains within like different sites. We just take on the trained weights, put them all together and train it further. So there is a sense of data sovereignty. So the data lives within the infrastructure of different sites, but we just use the trained models, combine them all together. So we'll have like a master model that is capable of working with all data from different sites, capable of training and has the power of data from all the different sites. So there are a lot of new initiatives also coming along as we form this new AI and data science unit within the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. Um, yeah. So I mean, I want to stop there and open up for any kind of discussions.
Thank you so much, Jonath, for that very comprehensive and thoughtful overview of the context of AI and health research. Um, and I'll give you a second to let your voice recover. Um, I'll let folks. Oh, we have one question in the chat, and I'll invite others to put their questions in the chat, and I'll read them out for you, Jonath. The first one here for scrubbing of identifiers, PI or sensitive data prior to data leaving the site. Is there a possibility to customize this for projects? For example, could you ask the system to redact keywords or instances of self-harm for a given data set?
That is a very good question. So we initially thought of having this technology developed just for large language models. And then we later realized that this can be scaled from many different projects happening internally that uses identifiable information. So is it possible? Yes, we need to just explore. And also to note that this currently looks for certain, what we call as regular expressions. It looks for certain kind of patterns available within the files. So it looks for any kind of patterns that fits names. It looks for patterns that fits address, phone numbers, and all these kind of things. We're trying to incorporate some level of contextual awareness, which could basically be powered by the on-premise large language models we are planning to deploy. And in that case, there might be a possibility of redacting any harmful information that could be inputted into these tools. There's a lot more investment that needs to happen and a lot more research that needs to happen in our end to ensure that the tools we develop doesn't also return back any harmful information. So it's still in its infancy. We have developed it, but there's a lot of work we need to do on protecting the data that goes in and also ensuring the responses that comes out is not harmful.
Thanks so much, Jonath. Siobhan, feel free to reply if you need any more details from Jonath about that case. And thanks for the question. Jonath, one of the things that came up for me as a non-digital health or AI expert is just you mentioned human oversight and kind of the role of people in monitoring and overseeing any use of AI in a research setting. I'm wondering if you have a sense of from a regulatory perspective, with ethics approvals or privacy impact assessments, what types of roles within research teams, like who's sort of being assigned to do this type of oversight, and what are some of the trainings and qualifications that these folks are being asked to do? I'm thinking about in clinical trials, we have our, list of GCP training and all of those related tutorials. Are there similar modules or education and competencies that our regulatory bodies are looking for?
Um, Actually, I'm actually unsure about that question on if there are any kind of requirements from regulatory bodies on certain checklists or kind of requirements that people need to meet or any kind of training people need to go through. But there do exist a lot of AI checklist out there published by the government of Canada. I could try to find that link later, which is a very good kind of resource which people need to be mindful of to ensure that certain requirements are met. When we do research, it's a little bit more free. We have a little bit more freedom on how we conduct research. But when we think about the aspect of like translating um, the research findings into implementation and like deployment into like clinical settings, there will actually be like true harm if it actually like functions in a way it is not supposed to function. So one of the main requirements is to make it like more human centered. Have like end users, have patient partners, have family partners, have providers involved in the process of like development. Let them know this is how we are using the tool, this is how we are developing the tool, this is how the data is being used, this is how the system like now outputs results. Is this useful? Is this what you're looking for? It protects in a sense that there is more level of like governance around how we develop these kind of projects with more oversight, but it also ensures that we don't spend a lot of time and resources that end up not being adopted for implementation. So I'm not sure if there are any like requirements on training that needs to happen. I can take a look at it like later after this call. But there are certainly like good guidelines is out there that people can like look up to.
Thanks so much, Jonath. And I'm sure there were some great resources from PHSA and UBC that you linked in your slides. So happy to share the slides, PDF them, and send them out to the group if that's appropriate.
To do that. And UBC also has like training hub that's under the Gen AI like website. The link is also in the slide deck. People can go there, like, and they also have some kind of like news feeds every now and then to keep the community more updated.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Jonah? Feel free, you can raise your hand, and I think I have the power to unmute you. And if you want to ask your question in real time, if it's lengthy or nuanced. Siobhan, go ahead. You should be able to unmute.
Just because I'll just be annoying and monopolize your time. You're talking about the REB and how they were open to having tools used so long as data is not being like exiting out of our system. So what is it like? How exactly, like, sorry, go back. Did the REB communicate kind of how they would like to see that information provided in their REB documentation or like in your REB applications? Are there specific things that we should say? Because I think the majority of people who are doing kind of this work, and maybe not, they might not necessarily know like where things are going. Is this on-prem? They might not know the differences. So for example, they're like, okay, well, it's PHSA's Microsoft Copilot, and I just asked it to do this thing. Is there a way that we can know within certain if something's going outside? And then again, how do we communicate that to the REB?
Um, yeah, I mean, we basically need to like look into the fine prints of certain things. For example, like we know that when we use like a Microsoft Copilot available through PHSA, that there is some level of assurance that the data doesn't like leave our infrastructure because there were certain level of like reviews that would have happened before like PHSA approved use of these tools for certain purposes. When we try to like use these kinds of different tools, there will be more questions like Reb will ask on how the data is being handled, whether it leaves the infrastructure or not. When it comes to tools that we deploy internally within BCCHR, we can provide information as to how the data is being handled, where it is being stored, and all this kind of things, and what level of security measures we have around it. But once it goes into cloud, we just need to assume it goes into cloud and just say, okay, the data is leaving, and we need to assume the worst when it comes to the lack of sovereignty around it. We need to assume that once the data leaves, it leaves, and we don't have like no control over it anymore. And that is because of the lack of verifiable assurance we have on the terms and conditions, certain companies like OpenAI would have. They would say, like, you have complete authority over the data, but how the data is being used behind the scene, we probably wouldn't know. So in that case, we just need to assume and be transparent with these ethics boards and approval bodies that we are using these tools, and if there is a need for more review, that requires like further conversations on a case by case basis. From a research ethics standpoint, it is important to ensure like data privacy. Don't want to speak for the ethics board itself. If there are any kind of like ethics board representatives here, like that would be great. Like if they can chime in, data privacy and security would be of importance to them. So if there is any kind of like privacy impact assessments that were done by bodies like Privacy Matters with UBC or PHSA Privacy, that might be of more comfort to them. And PI is also like oftentimes defined like what kind of data can go in. And we can also like always go back and like reflect on if we are putting in the data that we are supposed to put in that is covered by the PIs. That could provide a little bit more comfort on that area. And I believe there is also an AI checklist, which Rep currently like requests people who do like AI projects to complete. I believe that's more for like a custom AI tool development. Have not like looked closely into it, but yeah, that's also another kind of like checklist like we could look into on how to like streamline the process when it comes to review of AI tools that we want to use for research purposes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks, Manny, who brought up and Farron's here too. So we've got our local REB. Thank you so much. So we've got the AI checklist information, and Farron has sent the one for C&W as well. Wonderful. Thanks so much for the wealth of knowledge in this chat. It sounds like too that this group is keen to have maybe some quick reference resources. I know it's been about a year since we released some of our own Research Institute AI guidance, so perhaps we can round up some of the resources from the chat here and from Jonath's presentation and update our pages. So we'll make a note to do that. Wonderful. Any other questions for Jonath? Favorite AI tools, things we should avoid?
We've got a silent or quiet crowd today.
Yeah.
Yeah, anytime, any questions, like feel free to email me or just send an email to adsu@bch.ca. We're happy to like respond back or have consultations or guide you to appropriate resources.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonath, for being here today and for giving us an overview on some of these initiatives that are forthcoming and just really staying on top of how do we move alongside this thing that exists and in a good way. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Our next Lunch and Learn is in December, and I believe the topic is reflexivity practice within research teams. And we've moved the date up. So our next Lunch and Learn is scheduled for December 10th at noon. And our presenter is Julia Santana Padilla, who's our qualitative research analyst at the WHRI. So different topic, but we hope to see you all there as well. Thanks for joining. Yeah, we hope your voice gets better, Jonah.
Yeah, hopefully.